as everybody starts coming into the webinar, we're going to do a little bit of admin to update you on what's going on with AHA with Amplify, and then we'll get started. So we're really excited that we have a new season of AHA with Amplify. So many of you had a chance to join us live last week where we had the pitfalls of M&A. We had a really, really great session. And if you missed it, you should definitely at least check out the PDF that we sent yesterday. It was a good session with Dr. Howard Johnson. And that was a live session because we are in a new world where live sessions are part of AHA with Amplify. But we're going to keep to our core and have webinars on the third Tuesday of most months. So other than December, when you're busy with your holiday season, and July and August, where you're hopefully on a beach, you can expect to find us here at noon Mountain Standard Time doing a webinar with some really great presenters and experts such as today. We're very excited that today we're covering governance. Next month, we're doing financial wealth and personal CFO. So it's a really good session for those of you that work with business owners and get pulled into areas that you're less than comfortable with sometimes in terms of financial wealth and wealth planning of those business owners and founders. It's also a really good session for those business leaders and CPAs that are thinking about their own wealth and their own financial planning and spend so much time in other people's numbers that we sometimes neglect to look at our own numbers. So the presenter that we have has done many, many presentations for CPA Canada. He's a well-known CPA Canada presenter. So stay tuned and watch for more information that'll be coming in the next day or so of the October session. And Nikki's going to share a link so that you can register in advance and watch for those details. That's the third Tuesday of October. In November, we're very lucky to have Rebecca talk on leadership. So the exact topic is to be determined. If you have a request on a leadership topic, please do let us know. Rebecca has been a member of the Chamber of Commerce here in Calgary, so very, very familiar with the Calgary small, medium, and growing business market. She also worked at Elevated and has had other consulting opportunities. She has been recommended to many of our clients, and we always get the best feedback. So we're super excited that she's going to join us in November. As I mentioned earlier, we'll take December off because we know how busy the month of December is with the holiday season. January, we're coming back, and we're super excited that Janice from Nutrien will be joining us for an IFRS technical update as well as ESG. She recently took a new director role in ESG, which is the wave of business, I guess. And so she joined that wave and is going to share her insight from an ESG perspective, as well as we're pulling her back to her roots of IFRS because we know that our CPAs expect an annual update on both topics. So you can expect that to happen in January, and there's lots more coming in the new year. So stay tuned, pay attention to our website. Tentatively, not yet booked, but very excited to let you know that chances are we're having a live session on November 3rd. So that live session will be early evening, late afternoon. And I think we're going to be talking about CPAs on the edge and what the CPA profession should be doing to help business leaders. So we hope that lots of business leaders join us as well as CPAs, and let's have like a really confrontational conversation about where CPAs should be helping our business community. And that's the plan for November 3rd. It's tentative, but stay tuned and make sure you pay attention to that invite, which will be coming soon. So without further ado, we're going to get started on today's session, which is governance. So before we roll into our fireside chat, as we like to call it, I'll ask Gerard to introduce himself and give a little bit of background.
Sure. Thank you very much for that, Jamie. And yeah, having listened to your lineup, I'm truly honored to be asked to speak today. I'm a CPA myself. I come out of a Big Four background, most recently as a partner with Ernst & Young. I'm a chartered business evaluator, so I've worked in corporate finance for most of my time, I guess, when I was in the professional advisory service. Currently, I have a portfolio approach to my life. I am a chair of McKay CEO Forums, and I'm a principal with Ozone Advisory, and we'll talk a little bit about that. At Ozone, we actually advocate for and are in the advisory services business around improving corporate performance through enhanced board performance. I'm a board member myself, both in for-profit, private enterprise, as well as in not-for-profit. And I still do a little bit of corporate advisory work under my own shingle. So that's kind of my portfolio life. If you'd like, yeah, sorry, Jamie, if you'd like, I can give a little bit more background maybe on what we do at Ozone, because it was really with the Ozone hat on that Jamie asked me to come speak with you today.
Definitely. So before we run into that, just want to quickly give a debrief. I know that for many of you that are attending with us, your fellow CPAs and many others are business leaders. And for a lot of us, we start our career getting told what to do in terms of reporting and contributing to board packages, and we never see that end product necessarily, but we're certainly aware of the deadlines and the contribution that we have to make. And then as we move into our career, we may have ownership of that actual board package and more of the consolidation and the messaging that's supposed to be getting across to boards. And then when we get to the level that most of you are here today, whether it be in a CPA role or a business leader role, there starts to be questions of what the right level of governance is, what the right advisory committees are. Should you have a board? Should you have committees? Should you, as an individual with a career path, be on a volunteer board? Should you be getting a spot on a paid board? Should you be writing that ICD test, which coincidentally, I believe they actually wrote yesterday. So maybe we have a few of them that would have otherwise attended but are hungover from governance, so they'll watch the webinar later. So a lot of us in our roles as business leaders and CPAs have governance as part of our job, part of our ambitions, part of our enhancing community. So I think this topic is super relevant in all areas of our life, and I am very honored to have an expert like yourself joining us to cover it. So yeah, let's dive into what you do with Ozone Advisory and how you help those business leaders make these decisions, or even know what questions to ask or when the right time to think about governance is.
Yeah, sure. So it starts with, I guess, like I said, our advocacy role. So we're active in the market, just having communication wherever we can, to be honest, around the value that a higher performing board brings. So this type of speaking engagement, for example, the type of work we do, we actually have 3 dimensions. So we do board design or board redesign. So if and again, mostly in the private company space, a little bit in the not-for-profit space. But if you're already at a point where you're starting to think that we want a different governance structure, and we're going to talk a lot about governance, this is a governance workshop. But if you're already there, then we would come in and look at what you currently have in place. And oftentimes it's what I call a more perfunctory board. You might have your brother-in-law, a family member, and the lawyer or the accountant, and that's your board. It might be more like a management council, or maybe some sort of an advisory board. But you're feeling like there's something that you're missing, or something that's changed in your circumstances that might want you to enhance the level of governance. So we'll come in and do that type of work. Like, we'll basically design and help turnkey what a new board might look like. We do board assessment work. So if you have a board, how well performing is that board? And the outcome of the work we do there is what we call a board development plan. No matter how well you're functioning, we believe, in our experiences, there's always an opportunity to improve and become even higher performing. So whether you take away 5, 6, 7 observations of things you can implement to improve board performance, that would be the outcome of a board assessment. And we do some board education programs as well. We do a structured course, which is called Private Company Governance. That's a 24-hour, 6-module course, kind of like ICD Light, but it's really tailored towards private enterprise. We do some custom training as well, like maybe come in and just speak to a board to refresh them on their understanding of the role of the board and the role of management, et cetera. And then we run a couple, we call them circles, but they're really facilitated networks. And for example, one's called Just for Chairs. Like, where do board chairs go to talk about board governance issues and share their stories? Because in the same way that CEOs often need to get support, board chairs do as well. And where does a board chair go to be vulnerable, I guess? So yeah, that's just an overview. So board design, board assessment, and board education programs.
Awesome. So we're going to launch a couple polls so that we have a better idea of who's joined us today. So we've got 4 questions. If people could participate and let us know where they're at from a governance experience perspective. That'll really help us direct the conversation accordingly. So if you could participate in the poll, hopefully you can all see that now, and put in your participation, please. While we wait for that, we often speak of governance in the context of the board, but what exactly do we mean by governance? How do you know when you're participating in governance as opposed to operations, for example? And we know one of the hardest things about the relationship between management and board is that line. And frankly, that line is different depending on the organization, at least from what I've seen, what's classified as operational, and whether operational is the evil, don't touch, or whether or not it is actually a board where the expertise and the getting your hands dirty is part of the expectation, or even the fun of being on that governance committee. So talk to us about, what do we even mean when we say governance?
Yeah, great question. And it's the only definition I think I'll throw at you today, because I looked up and there's various definitions for corporate governance, but the one I found that I thought was most succinct is it's a set of rules, practices, and processes used to direct and control a company. There's a lot in that little sentence, and from my experience, what we're finding is not all business owners or shareholders want to be governed. So I think that's why it's important to start there. And if we start to discuss different types of support systems, along this continuum of governance, it's important to know that, or have that in the back of your mind about, like, governance really is a set of processes and structures in its discipline, and those things that you spoke of, Jamie, like the relationship between management and the board, and just what activities are more proper in context and scope for the board as opposed to management. And I think that's the things we're going to further discuss here today.
Yeah, it's always a hard question. So as we expected, we have about 74% of our members attending here today that have experience on boards as a member of a board, and about 26 that have a desire but have no current experience. Within that group, the non-for-profit and charity is about 70%, with private company being another 17, and public or crown or public institution being about 14. So I think those numbers are pretty close to what we would have anticipated. So about 3/4 have experience with boards, and of those with experience, about 70% non-for-profit, and the rest a pretty even split between private and public.
Okay.
So exactly what we'd expect for this level, for sure.
Exactly, yeah. And just so I can put it in context for my background, through my professional career, I was always engaged in not-for-profit, and it had me reflecting on some of the organization I've worked with in the past. I've been in, across the gamut, really, public legal education. I've been in health services, minor hockey, which a lot of people probably on the call have been involved in some sort of minor sports association, whether it's dance, soccer, hockey, football. Calgary Crime Stoppers, I was on their board. I was on Junior Achievement. I still am on the Junior Achievement National Board, and I was on the local chapter board. I chaired that board. And then I'm currently still on the board of Alberta Ballet. So quite a diversity in my background, from not-for-profit as well as the private work that I do. I guess the comment I want to go back to on governance is, often you'll know how well or how poorly you're being governed by what are called the failure signs. And again, just for fun, if you Google governance failures, there's a ton of articles and war stories that'll come up. But the characteristics seem to be effectively an ineffective board, lack of internal controls, not keeping up with the regulatory requirements, inadequate social responsibility policies, and inadequate risk frameworks. So again, from our roles as CPAs, you can see how pretty much all of that is relevant. So you could really tie our function, the finance function, quite directly to the performance of a board. And then if you put all those conditions together, you get effectively a train wreck. And so coincidentally, I want to share a story because I was just on a flight coming home yesterday, and I actually watched a documentary show called Trainwreck, and it's about the 1999 Woodstock Festival, and it was a train wreck. And I couldn't help but think about it in the context of board governance. Like, where was leadership and oversight, as opposed to having a couple cowboys run off and run this festival that turned into just a disaster. So train wrecks a good thing to keep in mind, I guess, in terms of what you could end up with if you're not effectively governed.
Yeah, those are really good points to consider. So the various types of boards, we alluded to it a couple times already today, but we've got a lot of times the setup is the traditional board of directors, and then an audit committee, and then maybe a couple other specific types of committees, depending on the industry, or whether it's a public company or private company, or of course a non-for-profit. So let's talk about what you would consider a classic structure, and what the creative ideas are that you could deviate and think about outside of that classic structure. And let's do an overview. Despite the fact that 75% have had experience with the board, let's pretend they're brand new, because there's some that are.
Again, fair question. I think so I look at it as a continuum. So at the far left, I mean, maybe we often see this in the context of our startup community. It's truly advisors. It's an advisory panel, subject matter experts or capital markets experts, but they're not being called upon to govern. And I think that's why I wanted to start with that governance definition. They are truly there as a sounding board and advisory voice for management. We're in the process of being engaged now on a board redesign. And when we discuss what the current model is that's in place, and they call it a board, but it's really a management council. Everyone that participates there's no independence. Everyone that participates is part of management. Everyone that participates is a shareholder. They vote proportionate to their shareholder interests. So that would be an example to me of fairly extreme end of the continuum, where that's really not a governance role that's being executed there. That's just a higher level operations meeting where they might change up the agenda a bit to talk about different topics. So you really want to, again, be careful what you wish for, because to go to the full end of a governance spectrum, what I'll call a full fiduciary board, that responsibility, and we're going to talk about that a little bit deeper here, but the hindsight, oversight, compliance function at a minimum is taken very seriously, and then the role of the board extends even more beyond that into strategy, risk, talent management, etc. So it's a continuum, and for different parts of the life cycle of the organization, each one of those is appropriate.
So if I was to join an advisory committee, based on what you just told me, the benefit would be that I don't have the responsibility and liability, because I'm there truly as an advisor. The downside would be I could spend my time and effort and not be influential or have an impact or be listened to. Is that an accurate interpretation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was invited to join an advisory board last year. Shame on me to a certain extent, because I asked for the terms of reference of the board and they didn't have any. So that should have been the first flag. But after attending several meetings, it became very clear to me we were not a board. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, we were a group of advisors. But I had to start to question my own relevance to, not subject matter expertise for the particular type of business that it was, the types of issues that the CEO was wanting to bring to the table for discussion. But more to your last point, Jamie, what I was learning was that there was a lack of, I guess, a disappointment in the amount of acceptance of the advice that was coming. And so as a result of that, we actually had conversations around, what are we? and that board, I'll call it, is currently disbanded while the CEO is reconsidering really what he wants to put in place.
Because I suppose when you're talking about a board and you're taking on that liability and responsibility, if you're actually an advisory board, but you're taking on that responsibility and liability, that's something you need to consider personally and for your own career as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I met with someone recently who said, "Oh, I'm on a board," and it was, but it actually wasn't a board again, but it's called a board. It's actually a customer user group for feedback, but they call it some kind of fancy name, customer something or other board, right? So I think sometimes I think it's really clear if you're going to get involved in a board that you know what the nature, the function of that organization is, and what the terms of reference are, and what's expected of you along that continuum for governance.
Good points. So for the members that are attending, if you want to ask any questions, feel free to type them in and I'll make sure to incorporate them either at the end or at the right time in the conversation. So we're happy to hear from you at any point. All questions do need to be typed and then we'll take a look at them. So responding to feedback from the poll, what's the recommended use of time for board meetings? So this part of the poll, I shared the results with everybody here, but just to recap, about 57% of our members think that about 1/3 of the time that you spend in meetings, at board meetings, should be spent on issues of hindsight and oversight. 30% think it should be about half that meeting time. And about 5% think it should be 2/3 of the meeting time. And 10% are saying that 100% of the time that I'm in a chair at a board meeting, I should be spending time on issues of hindsight and oversight. So maybe we should first talk about what would you define as an example of an issue of hindsight and oversight versus what's not an issue of hindsight and oversight. And then let's talk about the perspective of the members versus your experience of best practice.
Sure. So hindsight to me would be, like I say, I don't use the word perfunctory to mean I'm belittling it. It's the table stakes of the board governance responsibilities. So that are things that you can cover off with a best practice that I employ is I get what's called a compliance certificate signed by management. So things like environmental standard, we have no knowledge of any breach of regulatory standards, with no knowledge of breach of employment standards. Payroll and tax deductions are current. So you get the idea, like those are safety statistics, if safety is an important issue in your organization. But there are things, and we're going to talk a little bit, I think, about how you can best use your time and shape the agenda. A lot of that material can be shared in a board package, and it doesn't require a lot of discussion. It's information item to the board. It's accountability by management to the board, but they are things that happen in the past that the board has oversight responsibility for, as distinct from foresight and insight, right?
And so those things would be where the consent agenda might come into play. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
And so what would a consent agenda, for those of us that haven't used it, and by the way, I love the concept, and I was on a board that switched from not having one to having one, and it was remarkable. So I recommend it highly myself, but tell us what it is and do you recommend it?
Yeah, so I think maybe to go back to the polling question, we recommend at least 2/3 of the time be on forward-looking conversation. So, and I applaud those that answered 100%. So, but might not be realistic to get to 100%. But clearly the majority of the time of the board should be spent on having what we call forward-looking conversations, which are strategic. They involve issues of talent management and risk and strategy. So in your consent agenda, like I say, we have a standing package where there would be a conflict of interest disclosure, for example, or like I said, the examples of safety statistics or employment engagement survey, things like that. But they're things that they're materials that can be shared in advance. Often as a board chair, you could always ask to have something pulled out of consent, and if you pull it out of consent, then it becomes tabled for discussion in the meeting, and that's totally fair too. But the majority of the board package is briefing you on, or it's disclosure on those consent areas, and then briefing you on the other topics that are going to get picked up in the meeting. So I have this rule of thumb, or I guess an expression I use. I bifurcate my agendas between working in the business and working on the business. And working in the business are largely the areas of consent agenda and standing reports like financial statements, etc. Working on the business is the issues du jour, like what are the 2 or 3 topics that management has top of mind and priority that they want to engage the board's insight and perspective on.
And so what about if, there's a component of the board meeting, whether it be in written form or verbal form, that management needs to update the board on what's happening, right? So a more generic update, which may include some issues that get put into the strategic working on the business agenda, but they have to have that background and that detail. Do you find that if there's a best practice idea out there that type of information, which is just an update, a review of current state, is best communicated in advance in written form? Mm-hmm. But then there's always the issue that, especially on a volunteer board or an unpaid board, that people don't put the effort into reading the pre-materials, right? And so then those that do show up having well prepared and read through the materials in a lot of depth get frustrated if there's still a verbal update, because there's those that are asking questions or probing and needing that update verbally because they simply didn't come prepared, or maybe they have their own learning needs, right? It could be that as well, I guess. So yeah. What's the best practice there, and how do you balance that? Because I think I've never personally been on a board, maybe they just aren't disciplined enough, that we didn't have characters in both boats, and then some friction and also some agenda issues because they don't do it the way that the agenda was designed, which takes way too much time sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, you get to know the personality of your board, I think, over time, and that's part of it. I think we'll talk about setting the agenda, but if you anticipate that's what's going to happen, then you're better off to ensure that you allocate time in your agenda for that. I might have misspoke a bit, or I might have confused the issue talking about financials in the consent agenda, because they're not. They're in the board package that go. But certain things that are working in the business still are in the agenda with time allocated to them. So a review of the financial statements is one of them. The CEO report is one of them. But we're not there to have the CEO present his report or his or her report, because it's already been in the package. So the time that's allocated in the agenda is truly only discussion time.
Nice. And are you seeing any cases where people are using more modern mediums like video or what have you in board packages, or is it still more traditional written? Like, I know that even in my career and my experience with boards, we went from being very written, paragraph, formal language and business writing to much more visual, use of white bullets. So that was a big transition over the course of my 15 years working with boards. I personally haven't been on a board modern enough that they're sending out videos, but is that happening to help people absorb information, or what kind of trends are you seeing with the mediums used to communicate to boards?
Yeah, I'd say it's probably still not highly adopted yet. I've seen video in certain examples, like, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of painted story, but painted story is a visual means of communicating your strategy, and you actually create like a film version of your strategic plan. I find those really engaging, and I've seen examples of that being used in that context. Or say you had a major construction project or something, and then there might be a video or pictures or something like that. But no, the most I've seen is at least getting a transition of board materials into a board portal, like some sort of a shared drive or something, so that at least all your corporate histories in one place, like all your minutes, all your matters arising, your historical board packages, your current board package, all of that's in a portal. So I guess I've seen that as being a best practice, but it's still not, it's not like it's really emerging technology.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
But even that, and truly on that, Jamie, it's still difficult to change people's behaviors. Like we show up at the meeting and half the people have printed out the board package, and but I am seeing the use of tablets and tools. Like myself, I use a Surface and I use Drawboard PDF where I can write on the documents. Other people use. So I think we're starting to see the use of technology for board materials, but still, I'd say it's still emerging.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know a couple of boards that I've been on, like I'll use my phone, but then they think you're texting the whole meeting. So there's a consequence to using your phone, that's for sure. So the Roberts Rules of Order. Can you tell me a story where you used that successfully, and let me know, are you a fan of it, and how does it help structure meetings?
I'm not a fan of it. And to be honest, I didn't really even know what it was, but in the earlier days of my career, that's just how meetings were run. So a real formality in the agenda and the time allocation and the formality of how you address each other, like Madam Chair, point of order, just the process for calling for a resolution, all those in favor, discussion, and having your vote. Like that's all Robert's Rules of Order. And at least, and again, I'm not speaking on behalf, I mean, those that are in the Crown Court boards might have a different experience about what the requirements are in the non-fiduciary but full governance boards, if I call it that. Then I'm not seeing that being applied at all. I think rather than Robert's Rules of Order, there should be governing principles that are in place, and that really is the documentation of how you will function as a board and what behaviors you expect from each other as board members. Being respectful, obviously waiting your turn. You can't have chaos, so you need to signal the chair that you don't want to speak on a topic. But I think you can accomplish the objectives in a way more friendly and informal fashion.
Nice. And we'll talk more about the board chairperson, but certainly a lot of things you mentioned do, if you're going to have that less formal, but yet not chaotic environment, it really has to leverage a skillful chairperson, that's for sure. So let's get into some details of the different areas of business and how, the two would interact. So whether you're a finance leader reporting to a board or a board or on a board having to work with a finance leader. Let's start there because it's the most familiar area for a lot of our members. What's the role of the board when it comes to finance, and how should we think about that as a finance leader when reporting to them?
Yeah, maybe I'll start by actually looking at that in reverse and what I would expect from the finance professional that's presenting to the board. The board needs to understand the finances. They need to understand the business model. They need to understand how economic, political, regulatory, strategic issues are impacting the business model. So telling the story and making sure that the story is told in a way that is understandable to the board is really important. I advocate to less is more. So one of the companies that I'm the board chair for, we've got a series of branches. There's quite a detail. There's a branch network. I mean, management obviously has very detailed statistics, branch by branch, department by department. That level of reporting is not necessary to the board. And I say less is more because you can always ask for more. So I mean, I would, the rule that I follow is take stuff out of the package and see if anyone asks for it. See if they notice it missing, right? And you'll probably find that they don't. More important though is, and you talked about visual tools. Like I'm a visual learner. Like rather than having an 8-page column or financial statement or something, like the more you can put into little charts and graphs and stuff like that, that really helps. Be a storyteller, I guess would be my advice. Interpret, don't just provide data. Interpret the results. Often what happens, unfortunately, the finance function gets driven so hard up to the close, the board package is due tomorrow, or, and there's not enough time to then synthesize, thoughts around the material, like it's get it out. And I'm kind of generalizing there, but the more that you can, tell the story. Remember that numbers are scary to a lot of people. Like I work on, like I said, I have a history of working on a bunch of different boards, even these nonprofit boards, very senior, accomplished people who are scared of numbers. They still don't really know sometimes the difference between a balance sheet and income statement, right? So, I find little things like call it a statement of financial position as opposed to a balance sheet, right? Because that's what it is. It's our financial position as at a date. Like I've said it that way to someone, and they're like, "Oh, now I get it." They didn't know what this balance sheet was, right? Like, just little things like that. Everyone understands cash. Like probably one of the most important, financial statements to communicate to a board is the cash statement. What's our cash position? What's our cash run rate, etc. So I don't know if that's answering your question appropriately, Jamie, but I think it's really just, everyone trusts you in that function, in that role. You get confidence by clearly communicating and telling people what the numbers mean.
Yeah, no, I think those are some good points, and a couple things to reinforce on that is, to the point that you made, but it's a good reminder for a lot of the members that are attending with us is that the vast majority of humans, and sadly, quite a few CPAs too, can't read financial statements. So to assume that your board can read a financial statement is a grossly wrong assumption, because very few humans, very few business leaders, and more than too many CPAs can't actually read financial statements. And that's okay. That doesn't make them less qualified even to be on the audit committee necessarily, because it's your responsibility to package it in a way that they can understand it. And to your point, you can use visuals, you can have KPIs, you can use cash and different wording and language, because the point of the financial statements is what they need to be able to understand and also support and challenge you on, not the old-fashioned table, which is required for compliance. That's not necessary, and they have to have that, obviously. It has to be in the package somewhere, but maybe that shouldn't be what you start with. Maybe it should be the graphical interpretation or the KPIs, and the actual financial statements are part of the package, but not part of the presentation in some cases. Would you agree or add to that?
No, absolutely. And like, and read their body language. I mean, do they look confused? do they look engaged? Are you getting good questions? If you're not getting any questions, to me, that might be a sign that you're not really, and they can be intimidated and they can be embarrassed. And again, these could be senior people on the board that do not want to show, and I'll use the word ignorance, but maybe that's too strong a word, but I've been on the board for 18 months and I still haven't asked that question that I really wish I should have asked 18 months ago. Like, what's this number mean again, or something, right? So yeah, just I guess my advice there is be helpful. Wherever you can reconcile. I'm a big fan of reconciliations, like show the path of where the numbers come from, where they go. If, and I think finance and management has to be accountable to whatever expectations have been set. So if you had a budget, now you've got a revised forecast, you go to the next meeting, you got a new forecast, that's fine. I expect that because that's the evolution of actual, but then show the continuity of like, last quarter we said we were trending to this, now we've got a new forecast and the difference is this, and there's 2 or 3 major variances. Perfect. We tell the story.
Yeah, no, exactly. That, and if you can turn numbers into a story, they'll be more likely to get engaged for sure.
Yeah.
The other thing that you mentioned, which I think is applicable to all areas of business, not just finance, is you mentioned, have the courage to pull something out of the board package and see if anyone notices. And I think you could turn that around too, and remember that just because something gets asked for the board package doesn't mean that it's an automatic, like every time must be included, right? So, whether or not you have a certain level of communication where you can ask those questions and have those discussions, or whether you even, go to the extreme and suggest that ad hoc ask is not reoccurring new contribution to the board package unless it's specifically asked to be a recurring contribution to the board package. Because I know that's one of the ways that board packages do get out of control, is that George from 1972 asked for analysis, and then we're busting our butt doing that analysis every quarter and including it in the quarterly board package. And it turns out that when George left the board, no one's understood this analysis or cared about it since, right? But it takes courage to take something out of a board package, absolutely. So I think that's something we all need to think about, because the more that's there, the less impact it's going to have on the reader. That's just the reality, right? It takes more effort to write a short story than a long story, or whatever that beautiful quote that Mark Twain has is. So if we think about the strategy side, then what's the board's role on strategy? What would you focus on there?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to just on that to think about what is strategy, right? And strategy is the enablement of your corporate purpose, right? So your purpose is your why, your strategy is your how. The board's role there is to provide the guidelines and the guideposts to really help management have clarity around what's in scope and what isn't in scope from a big picture perspective in terms of how we're going to execute on our strategy. I thought maybe the best way of trying to speak to that is give you an example that's pretty live for me right now. I'm helping a community in Alberta set up a community foundation for the first time. And so we had to start right from purpose. And so they have a great purpose: inspiring people, strengthening the community, and impacting our future. So then strategy is how. So then, the next part of that was, how are we going to do that? So again, the board's role is to say, okay, we're going to do 2 or 3 things. And strategy, again, the definition of it really, there's lots of different definitions, but it's really a sustainable differentiator or a sustainable competitive advantage, right? So again, it's the board's role to bring that perspective to it, and not to get bogged down into business planning or even strategic planning, which is another level of definition, but to keep it up at a high level. So this community foundation, for example, the foundation of their strategy is really simple, 2 or 3-fold. They want to kind of own the legacy gifting space, that'll differentiate them in the market, like endowment gifts, and longer term impact type of project investment. So nothing that's kind of short term. That's going to clearly differentiate them in the community. Now, the board doesn't have to get involved at the project approval level, like what type of project. They've helped set the framework for what the criteria are that's consistent with the purpose of the organization. So that's just kind of an example of that.
So you specifically said that it's a level higher than setting the strategy. So just to dig a little into that, for the growth businesses that Amplify works with, and a lot of our members would be part of, there's the classic maybe EOS model or what have you, where you have the quarterly strategy sessions as management, and then you have the annual strategy session where you either reset or refine your strategy. Would you invite the board to those sessions? What I heard from you is probably not, but I just want to validate that.
It's funny because I just made a decision to not have our board go to this year's retreat, because for a variety of reasons, the enablement of the strategy has not progressed that much in the last year, but the strategy itself hasn't changed. So the planning, like the strategic planning and the operational planning consistent with enabling that strategy, is still relevant. So management's going to continue to have a retreat, but to involve the board, there was really no new direction or guidelines that was needed from the board. But I wouldn't say that's always the case. I think annually annually might not be frequent enough for some companies. I mean, things are moving so fast, right? So yeah, I wouldn't want to say yes or no. It's most usual that the board would attend at least once a year.
Yeah, okay. And it depends, right? So that's good that we clarified that for everyone.
And you mentioned different frameworks. I just want to put a plug in because I like this. I think it's Lafley and Martin, I wrote it down. That's the Playing to Win framework. And I don't know if people are familiar with that, so I thought I'd throw that out there. But it's a great, simple framework to follow. Where are we going to play? How are we going to compete? Like, how will we win? What capabilities and resources do we need? And what systems and processes do we need to have in place? And if you can answer those, kind of go down that thought process, And again, that's a perspective the board brings. Like, if you go to the board would say, what framework are we using to define our strategy and enable our strategy? And if management's saying, oh, we don't really have one, and so the board's really there at that higher level.
Yeah, and I see the Playing to Win book right behind you, so I love that you've got evidence that you mean it. Funny enough, for Amplify, we would definitely go to, there's three books that we look at when it comes to strategy, and Playing to Win is absolutely core. And obviously, the founders come from an alumni that also used it in their consulting projects, so that probably is one of the reasons we're biased. But Playing to Win, I agree, it's not the newest strategy framework, but it stands the test of time, and there's a lot to it. And obviously Traction and EOS that we mentioned is one that is incredibly popular in our community, so it's certainly a must-read book around here at Amplify. And then there's another one that I constantly forget the name of, but I'll share it with the group later because it's lost on me right now. It's simply something, but I'll think of it later. So risk is an interesting one, because obviously risk committees are not unusual, and in certain industries would be an absolute requirement. Very, very common to see the audit committee structured as the audit and risk committee. I've personally been on boards where risk has been decentralized, and every committee had it on their agenda and had a component of risk as part of their standing agenda that they had to sign off on at every committee meeting. What is the board's role when it comes to risk, and where should risk sit in the committee forms of a board?
Yeah, I'll just pick up on your comment there. You're right. In most not-for-profits, risk is put with audit. Like, I chair 2 risk and audit committees right now, and the challenge with that is it's hard to give appropriate and due time to risk. I find you end up getting down the path on finance, and then you run out of time at the end of your meeting. Oh yeah, and risk. Here's the updated dashboard or something, right? So I try to bring more discipline to that, to actually set a sub agenda for risk, and to bifurcate the time in the risk and audit committee meetings so that effectively risk is a subtopic that's getting its own attention. But back to the board's role, I mean, the board's role is really at what we call enterprise level risks. Like, what could break you? Like, what are the types of risks that are really that big an exposure that they could cause, really, detrimental harm to the continuity of business operations or reputation and things like that. Fair to say, if you use social media currently as an example, that it's brought a lot more risk, I guess, into that board purview. CEO and executive behavior, for example, right? So I guess the main thing is that there's a process. Again, this comes under the board's governance, clear governance responsibilities. So ask the right questions. What do we do? How do we, as management, identify the key risks? How do we prioritize those risks? How do we monitor mitigation plans? Do we know what level of risk we're comfortable with retaining as an organization? So that's that whole risk tolerance, risk appetite. And that's a board level question to understand. Like, there's a conscious trade-off of risk and reward, and there's a certain amount of risk in every organization that you should be willing to retain. But those are conscious decisions, and that guidance and oversight needs to come from the board so that management understands it appropriately.
Those are all really excellent points. What about talent management? Obviously, that's a hot topic in our age of the Great Recession. And, one of the toughest part of a board's role, especially depending on who else is on the board, is that idea that the CEO reports to the board and can only really be terminated by the board in most cases. But obviously, talent management at all levels can be very impactful to a business and to all the other areas we talked about, risk and strategy, finance, etc. What is the board's role on talent, and how deep into the organization should it go? What have you seen for best practices when it comes to that people side of things? because at the end of the day, every business is about its people. Doesn't really matter what industry you're in.
Yeah, and that's an emerging area. Like I would say the amount of focus and attention on at a board level on talent and people management is at an all-time high. And again, if I go back in time, I don't even remember it ever being on the agenda, to be honest. So, so yeah, there, again, it's about asking questions to ensure that management has appropriate systems in place. So whether it's the performance, like what's the pay philosophy, what's the performance management system that we adopt for the company? How is it aligned throughout the organization from top to bottom? And frankly, is the board aware and is the board aligned? How do we know what our culture is? I always say, I use the example of a personal brand because I learned this about 20 years ago. Everyone has a personal brand, so you better know what it is because you can consciously manage it. The same with culture in your organization. It exists, it's there, it's measurable. So I think you're seeing more organizations now formally conduct culture assessments, even if it's a subset of your employee engagement work. But there's a way to kind of subdivide aspects of employee engagement and to try to really hone in a little bit more on your culture. So example would be like, is it a risk-taking culture, or is it a fear from the top culture, and what are the implications of that in terms of how people behave and how decisions get made? Are you in tune with ESG? And obviously the initiatives, everyone's struggling now with back to work coming out of the pandemic, but it goes beyond that, and these topics of quiet quitting, etc. Right? I've really quit, but they're going to keep paying me until they find out, right? D&I, like diversity initiatives, etc. So again, the board's role starts with being aware of the importance of these issues and asking of management how talent is being managed, but also providing guidance to say, is that consistent back with our organizational purpose? Is it aligned to the execution of our strategy, etc.? So all these pieces tie together.
It is interesting, right? Because probably in the past, they would have considered that more operational. Yes. And been less willing to ask those challenges or questions or what have you. But now things are obviously changing, and to some degree that might be a positive move in the direction of acknowledging how important it is from a foundational perspective. So that's an interesting trend that you're seeing for sure. So if I'm sitting on management and I bring something to the board that I consider a finished product, but I haven't done side meetings or done buy-in or necessarily gotten the opinion or perspective of the board ahead of time, and they reject it, and we end up going a whole different way, do you consider that a failure of management, a failure of the board, or a nice progressively good story? What's your perspective on that? I know in the old-fashioned boards, it would be one where by the time you get it to a board, if it's not ready to be stamped for approval, there's an issue, and that would be a sign of poor performance or poor buy-in or what have you. And there's, in the old school of boards, there's a lot of side meetings, a lot of buy-in, a lot of politics really between management and board happening. So by the time you get to that board meeting, it really is just a stamping exercise. Mm-hmm. But then when you talked about some of your perspectives on an effective board meeting where there's challenges and issues and strategic and forward thinking, mm-hmm. that would imply that it's a bit more collaborative and there's more room. So nothing's on extremes, and obviously the actual answers depends, but how much should management be 100% final and done when they bring something to board, and how much should be open conversations? Like where's the line, and what's success?
Yeah, again, great question. I'll start by saying culture again, because the board has a culture and it has to be aligned with management's culture. So if fundamentally there's a belief, and there's trust and there's transparency, and everyone is exhibiting professional behaviors and respectful behaviors towards each other, that's fine. And that's what you'd want. I think there's more of an evolution that you don't need to have it fully baked. You know, you don't have to keep polishing the apple. Like, just bring it to us because we want to see directionally where it's at, if we're aligned in our thinking, and maybe there's 2 or 3 inputs we might have to the process to allow it to move to the next step. So 2 examples I have recently. One was our revisiting a purpose statement, and management had done a lot of work, but they wanted to test it on the board, and that was great. Great discussion, great feedback. Sent it back to management, and then it came back to us. And another more recently is a whistleblower policy. With the same thing, a draft of the policy got shared with the board. Board had some feedback. Look at this, look at that, make sure it's reviewed by legal, and then we sent it back. So, you know, I think that's a more realistic expectation and probably more aligned with today's culture of the board, rather than try to make it all fully baked and rubber stamped. That's not the type of board that we would advocate for anyway.
If you're a board member and it's a collaborative culture where things aren't being rubber stamped or fully baked and ready for finalization when they get to the board meeting, would you recommend, if you were coaching me as a board member, that I lean towards, you know, asking questions and framing it from a curiosity perspective? And I used to always use the words of like share in the comfort of management. That comes from my audit days, I think, if I recall, where it's like, okay, how does management get comfort on this? How do they look at the risk? How do they look at the KPI, et cetera, before asking questions or giving tips? Or would you coach someone to bring their experience and their stories and their best practices, or someone that's advisory and has ideas and visionary and new perspectives? Where is the contribution of a board member supposed to be, or does it depend on the situation and their actual experience?
Well, more to the latter, and I should have started by saying the role of the board is to add value to management and to help the organization achieve its purpose. And if the board members stay anchored in that, like, what am I here for anyway, right? And then again, the culture and the expectations of the board members. So I mean, I wrote down 8 or 9 things here, like of how a board member should show up, right? Genuine interest, curious. They've invested some time to understand the industry. They've done, you know, they do their own professional development to stay current, live the values of the organization, be prepared, like you said before, read the package, participate respectfully, you know, be courageous, ask good questions, and then have fun, right? Bring some positive energy to the meeting. And if you have board members that are behaving that way, and a board collectively behaving that way, management should look forward to coming to board meetings, and there should be a lot of energy, enthusiasm, and fun and enjoyment coming out of a board meeting.
So interestingly, this is an off-topic question, but I just have to ask it because it's actually personal for myself. I get a little bit of video fatigue because I have too many video calls and video meetings. And so I've been struggling to find my next volunteer board because I refuse to join one that's on video. And yet at the same time, I think the move to video board meetings, which is pretty prominent since COVID, and a lot of boards haven't shifted back to being in person, makes a lot of practical and logical sense to me because of, you know, being in different cities and towns. And just especially a volunteer board, you know, that extra time in the car is a huge extra commitment to the volunteer hours you're putting in. What are your thoughts about in-person versus video in today's world? Do you have a best practice or a recommendation on that?
My own personal view, I think it's still hard to replace, you know, person to person. Like, an important role of the board chair is to facilitate the conversation, and a lot of that is reading body language, you know, trying to ensure that people that aren't speaking get an opportunity to speak, people that are speaking understand that, you know, might be more appropriate to wait their turn, etc. So certainly from a chair perspective, it's more challenging to chair virtually, but and then there's the social engagements, right? The cookies and coffee come in, or you go to lunch. And as you know, often the best conversations are the ones that happen before and after a meeting. So I still advocate for in-person. But
No, good to hear for sure. So speaking of the board chairperson and your point is really valid. Obviously, some Zoom and video meetings with the chairperson that's not comfortable in that environment will be deal breakers for sure. So our members all predominantly thought that all three of the characteristics were important attributes for a board chairperson. So that being process-oriented and concerned with efficiency, alignment with organizational purpose, and being a good listener. There was 14% that felt that alignment with the organizational purpose was so important that it trumped the all of the above, and a few that thought being a good listener was of such importance that it trumped. None of them thought process-oriented or concerned with efficiency was important enough to trump all of the above. So anything else that you want to bring out in terms of if you're going to be a chairperson, or if you're aspiring to move from being a board member to a board chairperson, what are those skills and experiences that you need to get in order to do that effectively? Or alternatively, if you're a business leader and you're making the very hard decision of looking for a board chairperson, who should you be looking for?
Yeah, that polling question was intended as a bit of a lob ball. It's interesting though that those two items identified as being higher, because I could see that take on it for sure. But you definitely listen more than you talk as a board chair. Remember that and you touched on this already, Jamie, it's the board chair that has a more personal relationship with the CEO. And it's kind of that umbilical cord on behalf of the board to management. So, you know, I'm probably extra attuned to, you know, body language and the behaviors of the CEO as I'm sure they are of me, right? And I think that's just important as well, that you're not there to represent your own personal interests, even more so as a chair, that you're there representing the whole of the board. Yeah, so therefore, you know, your governing principles that are in place for your board as the chair, you absolutely have to demonstrate them and be the role model on that, to maintain the trust and transparency. You know, you can't have camps, you can't have, you know, pre-calls before the meeting to lobby for positions on resolutions and that type of thing, right? Like you have to be kind of above reproach a bit as a chair, but.
Nice. So if you're an individual board member, and we touched on this a little bit already, but if you're an individual board member, what can you do to be the best board member you can be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's some of the behaviors I talked about earlier. You know, it's really about showing up. Yeah, I think I went through those characteristics, but be prepared, be respectful, ask good questions. I mean, the board is there to be curious. Be conversational, look for what's not there. I think that's probably a big oversight. People will often respond to the material that's put in front of them. You know, a good board member will seek out and ask questions, not just for the sake of it, but, you know, are there alternatives we haven't thought of? What are the implications of not making a decision today? You know, things like that, right? As opposed to just kind of falling in step. I think a good board member that's curious to ask good questions, respects management, respects each other. That's all you could ask for.
If you're in a board meeting, when should you have an in-camera and when should you not? What should be included in that in-camera, and how prominent should those be? And does every board need them?
Yeah, I'm not, just make sure everyone understands or knows what in-camera is. So my practice is we go in camera without any management representatives at the start of a board meeting. So that's a chance for us to really have our initial conversations as a board, any reflections on the board package. If I haven't already got any indication of anything they maybe want pulled out of consent agenda to talk about, any observations we may have just around, you know, I mean, often it's me sharing something. I've had conversations with the shareholder that I want to share with the board for context, or I've had conversations with the CEO that I want to share for context. So that takes place at the start of the meeting. The caution on in camera is when people don't know what you're talking about, and if you're talking about them. So, you know, it's some schools of thought that don't even support in cameras at all. But I do believe that it's appropriate for the board to meet without management present. And then at the end of our board meeting, we have an in-camera with just the CEO, because if other members of management have been present, then they get excused. And then we'll ask the CEO, how did that go? How did he feel about his own team members and how they participated? Just basically an opportunity for the CEO to give us feedback, or for us to give feedback directly to the CEO at that time. And then we'll do one last in camera where we'll excuse the CEO and the board does a wrap up, and usually it's just around how did that go? Often I'll ask for feedback as a chair. What could I have done differently? What could we have done differently? Do you think we used our time effectively? Did we have the right topics on the agenda? Like, those are good questions for a chair to ask in camera. Again, there's a sensitivity to not going too long because management now thinks you're talking about them. Often we're not even talking about them, but the longer in camera goes on, the more nervous they get, and I think that's fair. So I think it's just important to manage that time appropriately.
And so, what happens if you're in a private entity where a portion of the board members are also part of management? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, we would. I'm an advocate for so the independent board members would stay in camera. Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a lot behind that, Jamie. Like, they would have already understood why it was important to have independent members as part of their governance model. And independence members, then that's a great question, because independent members then, in that context, take on a different role than they might otherwise. In the case of the board I chair, we're all independent members.
Nice. So you have the ICD certificate. We talked a little bit about some of our community members wrote the test yesterday. What are your thoughts on that education program versus other education programs specifically for being a board member? And I think, you touched on specific books and, other areas that might not be about being a board member, but could certainly give you experience that would make you a better professional that could be a board member in the future. What are your thoughts on education and learning in general when it comes to aspirations for working with boards or being on a board?
Yeah, there are some great books. I mean, self-study for sure, probably the least expensive route, buying a few books. There's some great books out there we can recommend. A lot of just services, many of them are free. So like McKinsey, for example, is really good. There's a gentleman by the name of Scott Baldwin. He has a really good email drip kind of campaign on materials. ICD is a structured program. There's a relatively new program called IGP, and it's actually was founded by and funded by Jim Basile, and it's on innovation governance. So if you're in a startup where issues of intellectual property management, for example, and cybersecurity risk, et cetera, those types of topics get covered a little bit more depth in the IGP program. There's competent boards, which is becoming quite well known now because they have an ESG certificate. So yeah, there's a combination of formal and informal. Obviously, I mentioned Ozone, and we do a private company governance course as well. So there's options for formal and informal.
So for those of the members that have, most of them have experience on boards and most of them have experience on non-for-profit charity boards. So I think, we could make the assumption that many have started their board career with that volunteer opportunities. Significantly less have actual company, whether it be private, public, Crown Corp or government board experience. So if the aspiration is for that classic career path where people want to retire but not retire and get paid significant compensation because they're on paid boards when they're retired from their day job, if that's a career, first of all, is that a good goal, or is too many people looking for it, so it's not going to be possible? But second of all, what is the path, and how do you lay the groundwork to get there if that's where you want to go? And what is reasonable for compensation? Are they actually going to get paid quite well that it's a semi-retirement, or is that generally not a big factor in being a board member? What have you seen, and what do you recommend?
Yeah, I'll certainly differentiate, private and public and Crown from the NPOs. I kind of laugh because anyone that works in nonprofit knows that you pay them and they don't pay you. It always works in reverse, but still great
We
experience.
did have just as quick side note,
Yeah.
I had an interesting conversation in Vancouver about that, right? Is that you're giving all your time to the board, and then yet many NPOs have very specific dollar amounts that have to be contributed to the charity as well. And it's interesting because time and money are both of the greatest value, or at least the most measurable values, I should say. And yet they want both.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's
I
important.
hear you.
And so if if you're someone who's looking at going on a nonprofit board, certainly understanding what that financial commitment is. Hopefully you get involved in an organization that aligns to a cause that you support. So it's really like, for me, it's always just been where my charitable dollars have been allocated, right? So, but yeah, both, in my case, both the ballet and JA both had endowment campaigns last year, right? So it's like, and they all want to say 100% board participation, right? So that was a bit of a side note. So you pay the NPOs. In my experience with private companies is compensation for a board member is around $30,000 to $35,000 a year. There are different, and then the chair, again, rule of thumb, the chair usually gets about a 50% premium on top of that because of extra responsibilities the chair takes on. Different models exist though. Some have meeting fee structures, some have a retainer plus meeting fees, some have a retainer plus meeting fees plus committee meeting fees, right? So it really depends on the model. But from the work that I've seen done, there's not a lot of public data available in the private space, but you're somewhere in that $35,000 type range. So yeah, not exactly put your career and retire money on one board, but as part of a portfolio of things you do, if you had a couple paying boards, it certainly would contribute.
Interesting. So if people want to get to that level, do you think it's important that they do start with that volunteer board experience?
I think so. I mean, you definitely want to demonstrate board experience. And it's one thing to have the education programs. So I think it's important that you have some form of certificate, something that demonstrates, a personal investment in learning about governance. But having actual board experience, and then it goes beyond that. I guess obviously you can take committee chair responsibility or ultimately a board chair responsibility. I mean, it's like you're building your resume, right? It's a new professional resume. My resume today is a board resume, as opposed to having been my career resume, right? Because I'm not aligned to operations management now, so I have to demonstrate governance experience, right? So the more you could, add to that resume, the better.
Great. So we're wrapping up, and I understand we have a technical issue with asking questions, but I think a few I'm aware of. So I'm going to ask a few random questions. You'll have to think on your feet. So you mentioned ESG more than once. It's obviously really a hot topic, really a hot topic. The amount of conferences I've been to this year where ESG was more than a third of the agenda was a lot. So ESG has the word G in it. So what are your thoughts in terms of governance, ESG, and being a board member? That's a very broad question. So your things that come to mind in today's world of ESG.
I think the fact that we're having this conversation today, right? This is an example of governance being a topic. I mean, 60 or so people decided to have their sandwich and listen to this. So, I think awareness of governance, the importance of governance, a curiosity to learn more about the role of boards and governance. That's one example. But we know in Canada, the Securities Exchange mandatory disclosures on governance has changed, or it's in the process of being changed. A whole new set of governance standards that codifies the expectations for governance that exists in the SEC as well. So there's just, again, more regulation around and disclosure required around governance practices, whether it's say on pay, like pay for performance, whether it's your diversity and inclusiveness policies, et cetera, right? We are we're moving towards more regulation, not less. So I think in the governance area, we're only going to see more expectations, I guess, piled onto companies.
And so if you're a private company and you are going to launch governance and a board for the first time, and you're trying to attract and develop a board with the right members, what are the top things you're going to think about? Now, if I was sitting there, I'd be thinking about, do I want shareholders or fully independent or management? That's obviously a big consideration. And when a lot of early boards have shareholders and management and don't even have any independence. But if you're starting out and it's your first board, what's the right thought process when it comes to that question? I'll start there, and then I've got a few others.
Okay. Well, I guess to answer that, I'll tell you what our design process is, because I think it goes hand in hand. So we absolutely start with documenting what we call the voice of the shareholder, because again, this governance model puts the board in between the shareholder or the source of financial capital and management, right? That's what the governance layer is. So what are the expectations of the shareholder? Like, what do they want? And back to that continuum, like, are they willing and wanting to go to a level of governance? Or do they really want like business advisors or strategic advisors? So you really have to start there. Document terms of reference for the board, because that codifies effectively what the job responsibility is for the board. Then run that by the shareholder. Is that resonating? Is that landing with what they thought? And then from there, you would start to build out, an ideal or a target board experience matrix. And our work in that space goes beyond just the accountant, lawyer, and marketing person, right? But actually, like for example, we just did a design of a company that's executing on a roll-up strategy. So yeah, they wanted someone with corporate development experience that's actually worked in a roll-up, both from negotiating acquisitions, but more importantly on integrating the businesses once they're acquired. A very specific set of experiences, right? So they weren't just going out looking for a finance person. They wanted and other people are looking for a finance person that's done a capital raise, for example. So if you're a startup and you're going to go from friends and family through to Series A to bringing in private equity, a finance professional that's lived that journey already is going to be someone that could be helpful on a board, right? So being really specific, I guess, around it. If it's marketing, it's someone who's launched, social, like consumer experience selling in a social media environment or something, if that fits your business model, right? So yeah, that's where we would start anyway. It really comes back to what governance model is needed and what's being looked for by the shareholder.
And I noticed that the order that you put it in and the skills matrix coming ahead, at least this is what I heard, ahead of those diversity considerations. So is that accurate that you would put that skills matrix above and beyond having the diversity?
Yeah, I mean, there's other considerations like global experience versus just local. Diversity, whether that's visible minority, whether that's gender, whatever, those increasingly are like basically, so I didn't mean to exclude those. I was talking about the experience side of the resume, but then there are other considerations that come in around, like I know, for example, right now, I know two recent examples. One's the Edmonton Airport Authority. They're looking for 3 new members, but they all have to be residents of those communities, right? So sometimes there are very specific requirements that need to be brought into the search. But yeah, D&I is just I'd say again, it's table stakes now. It's a standing consideration, but it doesn't necessarily drive the experience. It's part of the overall assessment of the best candidates that meet the overall requirements.
So I guess that hence why it's referred to as a matrix, right? Because it's not a simple table of this skill, yes, no, check the box. It's much more 3D in terms of whether or not your matrix is full of skills and
Yeah,
characteristics and experience, right?
absolutely. And I talked a lot about culture. So when you go through the interview process, you have to really feel comfortable that there's when I talk about culture, I don't mean, ethnicity. I'm talking about communication style and personal style, et cetera, right? So is there going to be ultimately you're looking for best fit, and that has to encompass all of that, right?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I guess one of the last questions I would have is that, if you're on a board, you made a point of saying that you need to be very careful that you're not there with your personal interest or your personal perspective as a driver. But what is the driver then? Is it the shareholder? Is it the community that the organization operates in? Is it the organization itself? What is that, if you get in a fork in the road and you have to say, my behavior and my actions and my decisions are, here's the hierarchy. What is that hierarchy as a board member here in Canada?
Alignment to purpose.
Purpose of the organization.
Yeah, and that's equally applicable in a non-for-profit as it is in a for-profit. Yeah.
And so that would just further to the point of how important it is that that purpose is defined and understood by both management and the board and the shareholders, so that you can use it as that North Star when you're doing governance.
Yeah. So that could.
So we're wrapping up. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say that'll lead to some personal decisions sometimes. Like someone might have a personal decision to say, I don't want to, I've ruled out cannabis as an industry I want to participate in, for example, or alcohol or tobacco or oil and gas, even, God forbid, right? So, so those are personal considerations because, yeah, you're investing a lot of yourself. Sure, you're getting compensated, but you become an ambassador for that organization. And again, the alignment of purpose to the culture of the organization is paramount for every board member. So it's not something you can fake your way through.
Yeah, that makes sense. And obviously where you put your energy. And in terms of this, it could be you're putting your money, your liability, or your time, or all three.
Your personal.
You want it to be something.
Yeah, your own brand, right? So.
Yeah, and you want to have an impact. So if you don't, if it's a purpose you don't believe in, and then you have an impact, that could be a problem.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up, first I want to ask if you had one story to tell, whether it be a story of a failure or a story of a success or just one that's entertaining, what story would that be? We'd love to hear a story from you before we wrap.
Oh gosh. I guess I always go back to early days on the ballet board. I guess this is what comes to mind on the spot, because we had a governance model in place for management, which is, we call it the two-headed monster, but we had separated artistic leadership from operations leadership. So we had an executive director and an artistic director, and I'm chairing the finance committee. And we've got a very passionate artistic director, as you'd expect to find in the arts. And, having to make artistic decisions with the business lens of, can we attract an audience? Are we going to sell enough tickets to pay for that? Like, trying to overlay a business model on a decision around the performance schedule that we were approving for a year. And there was one particular production I remember where, to get the artistic effect he wanted, it was going to cost a lot of money to build up the stage effectively, put in a bunch of risers. I can't remember the budget number, but let's say it was $100,000. And it was something that, here I am, the accountant, basically having to push back on artistic to say, well, is that really going to change the viewer experience? So that didn't go over well, as you can imagine. So, and he was French. If anyone knows the ballet, they know Jean Garmetre. But anyway, so I'll never forget it, because he's there in his French accent. He's there like, if you want crap, I'll give you crap. So I'm like, Jean, nobody said we wanted crap. But anyway,
I think that's a good point. Anytime you have artists involved in business and governance, it'll add a whole new dynamic of diversity of thought and perspective, right?
Yeah. And that's maybe that was a little bit more operational than you might get in a business environment, but in not-for-profit, sometimes you get a little bit closer to overseeing operations decisions. But anyway, that just came to mind, Jamie, because that's my funniest story.
Love it. And the last thing that you'd like to let our members know before we fully wrap up here.
I just sincerely appreciate their interest in the topic. Like I mentioned, the interest in governance is at an all-time high right now. I think for all the right reasons. I truly believe that a well-performing board will lead to higher performance in the business. And so I just applaud their interest in the topic and encourage them to continue to learn and practice. I'm a practitioner. I participate in these leadership forums myself. Like I can be better. I'm always seeking feedback as to how I can be better as a board chair, for example. So yeah, it's not something you learn and you're one and done. It's like our entire professional career, as we all know, as CPAs, has been lifelong learning, and it's not going to stop. But it's really interesting, and it's a whole new way of thinking when you bring a board lens to it.
Love it. For members that want to get in touch, we'll make sure to share your information in our next AHA with Amplify email. And that way they can ask follow-up questions, or if they have their own advisory that they need from Ozone or yourself, they can follow up and make sure they're in touch with an expert like yourself. We really appreciated that you were able to bring different perspectives, be it the formal education, the informal education, the non-for-profit management, being on the consultant side, and as an advisor as well. So it's been a really great conversation. I think we touched on a lot, and tons of it. You could go deeper and deeper, and hopefully everybody looks into it and follows up to do that. Quick reminder, as I mentioned, in October, we're going to have financial wealth. So watch out for more information on that. And I shared the Zoom link if you want to register today. So that's the third Tuesday of October. November, we're having leadership. And on November 3rd, we are tentatively having our next live event. So really appreciate everybody's attendance and engagement. And thank you, and have a great day. Thanks so much.